And so like okay, the basic thing is we're talking about, it's an art form, right? For instance, okay, here's this old television camera. Its function was to make a great picture all the time where everything was in focus all the time. Colors were good, image was sharp, and no matter where you zoomed, it made a great picture. It had XLR inputs, so you could take microphones, and its function was to make a great television picture for a television show that you were broadcasting, okay? That was its function, and there's still a lot of cameras that do this today that are made like this. This camera would be very difficult to make a narrow depth of field from it, actually virtually impossible. You're always going to have at least half of your scene in focus no matter how far you mess up this camera, okay? As opposed to this DSLR right here. This DSLR has a much larger imager. The larger the imager, the more narrow the depth of field. And then I can take and I can put on a lens onto this camera, and this would be, you know, a telephoto lens or a long lens, and now I can move this back further away from my subject and have a very narrow depth of field with this particular camera. This camera was designed to be a photographic camera, but now everybody's using it as a video camera because you have the ability to change lenses, you have the ability to have really sharp, really detailed picture because you have this huge imager, and you have the ability to add a long lens that gives you a narrow depth of field to give you a cinematic look on a very inexpensive camera, relatively. And so you can take these DSLRs and you can make a video with these and the lens, with this and the lens, and you can take a much more expensive camera and you can't really tell the difference. You might think you're shooting on a real expensive camera even though you're shooting on an inexpensive, this particular one here is an EOS Rebel SL1, which is a great camera, but it's not the very best one that Canon makes either. But yet, you know, here I can make a great image with it, and I can make a cinematic image. And so there's the two differences. And so with this camera, with these lenses, and with a DSLR, all of a sudden I've gone from being someone doing television production to someone who's doing cinema production, and actually I'm using the camera to paint a scene. It's not supposed to be realistic, it's supposed to be pretty. It's supposed to give me the ability to be an artist with video, you know? And so what I'm doing is I'm using all kinds of tools and things to allow me to paint an image with the camera that is beautiful. And it involves, you know, controlling the way light is entering the camera with aperture. Aperture, it basically is settings of control blades in a ring that are built into the lens, and this ring with these blades determines the amount of light coming into the camera, okay, into the imager or to the sensor in the camera. And if I can open my aperture way large, which means my f-stops go down, and then I can put a ND filter over it, I can make a really narrow depth of field, which is beautiful. The openness of an aperture is controlled by settings called f-stops. F stands for fraction of focal length, which is a unit of measure for the openness of an aperture. The lower the f-stop, the larger the aperture. The higher the f-stop number, the smaller the aperture opening. Aperture controls the depth of field, and the depth of field is basically the area in front of the camera that is in focus. You have a focal plane where if I'm a camera right here and I'm going toward the viewer, and I have a line, there's a plane in between us that is in focus, and it could be the entire distance from where I am to wherever the camera sees can be in focus, or I can narrow that and have a very narrow depth of field on that focal plane. And so, you know, and another thing, I'm shooting to control my depth of, I'm shooting where I control my depth of field to get a look. Areas being out of focus, if arranged properly, make a very beautiful look. And one other thing I want to point out when you're shooting, you know, a lot of times people grab a camera and they start shooting and they're moving all around, okay? When you have motion, you need to know, you want to actually have motion for a reason. If I'm doing handheld shooting, I'm not just moving all around for no reason. Whenever the camera's in a motion, there should be a reason for the motion, okay? It shouldn't be moving just because you're moving or because you're breathing or because whatever. Whenever you're shooting for something you're going to use, the motion has to have a reason for happening, okay? And also, whenever you're shooting a shot, maybe you want to remember that you need to take enough of that shot to where you, in post-production, when you're editing, you can actually use the shot. There's something called the 10-second rule. Whenever you get on something that's important, you want to shoot at least for 10 seconds so that you have enough information, enough time in that of that shot in post-production to make it usable, okay? But I was talking about f-stops and so forth. For instance, an f-stop of f4 is 1/4 of the focal length of the lens. Focal length divided by 4, okay? f4. So if I have a focal length that is like 100 millimeters, then f4 would mean that there's a 25 millimeter diameter opening of the aperture in the iris. Okay, so whatever you do, if I have an f divided by something, I know what my millimeters is of the lens, then I know that opening of the diameter of the aperture is going to be that fraction, okay? So that's how you would determine the openness of the aperture for that particular lens. Aperture and ND filters are the very best way to control exposure, okay? Now you can also control exposure using your ISO and your shutter speed. Don't do that, okay, unless you have a reason for doing it. If you want to get a good look, set your shutter speed to what is correct for your standard, whether it's television or film, okay? That's the frame rate, and just double the frame rate and you get the shutter speed. And then ISO should be native for the camera you're shooting with. You find out what the native ISO is for your camera and you leave it there. You find out what the shutter speed is for your standard, whether it's television or film, and leave it there. And then when you want to control your depth of field, use an ND filter, and maybe even better than that, a variable ND filter, and then your aperture. And so you adjust your aperture in most cases, even though aperture is designed for letting light in. When you're wanting to achieve a cinematic look, in my opinion, which is not always, it's not applying for all rules, but if you want to achieve a narrow depth of field, adjust your aperture to get the narrow depth of field that you want, adjust the ND filter to get the correct brightness that you want, okay? And then you want to back it off some where you can be shooting flat, where in post you can make a good picture, okay?